Yes.
At Berkeley. He also attended Cambridge. He was a former ANC freedom fighter who served as a member of Nelson Mandela's government. Andrew is also an activist and author. He wrote After the Party, Corruption, the ANC in South Africa's Uncertain Future, as well as the critically acclaimed The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. He lives in the UK with his partner and 2 children. We're thrilled to have you as a guest, Andrew, and I'm sure there are many in the audience who have followed your success and guest appearance over many months. Once again, give a warm Eastbourne welcome to Andrew Feinstein.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with an apology, especially to you. I have this awful habit of walking around as I talk, I mean. And I think the cause is probably that I'm what Al Gore described as a recovering politician. And according to Al Gore, it's a sort of a lifelong thing. But when we were first elected to government in South Africa, I was sent as the first ever governmental ANC delegation to the United States of America. And we went to Atlanta, Georgia, being the home of Martin Luther King Jr. We arrived at the airport. We discovered very quickly that Atlanta is also the home to CNN and to the Coca-Cola Corporation. So the mayor of Atlanta was at the airport to greet us, and he was a former professional basketball player. And to me, he looked as though he was about 10'7". And oh, there's a bad echo. Do I definitely need this? Oh, I just lost it, whatever it was. So I'm hoping I don't. Can we try it without? If I don't use it, can everyone hear me?
Yeah. So my problem is if anyone needs a loop, we need the microphone. Does anybody need the loop? No. All right, switch it off.
Great. My family tell me I speak too loudly all the time. So he greeted us, but he greeted us from behind an illuminated Coke can. And when he was finished, my boss, who I was traveling with for the first time, a guy called Tokyo Sexwale, who was premier of the Gauteng province in South Africa, who I didn't really know very well. I'd been working with him as his economic advisor for about 3 weeks. He said to me, Andrew, I'm too tired. You just go up and thank him. So I walked up behind this illuminated Coke can and I said a few words and I walked back down. And I said to him, Chief, was that okay? And he was also taller than me, as are most people. And he sort of looked down at me and he said, yeah, what you said was fine. It's just that all we could see sticking out of the illuminated Coke can was the very sweaty top of a bald head. So I think I probably, since then, developed a bit of an aversion to speaking behind anything. It really is a great pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's taken a long time for us to get it together, but we finally have, and it's so wonderful and such an honor to be able to speak after Yara, who obviously, to be able to hear about the situation on the ground from somebody there is just so invaluable, because obviously one of the key issues we face in the world at the moment is that our mainstream or commercialized media is failing us. We read and see what they want us to read and see, which unfortunately most of the time is a very partial story, if that. In addition to which, having investigated the global arms trade, conflict, genocide for over 23 years now, since I resigned from Parliament, which is a whole nother story. One thing I learned very quickly is that the first victim of any conflict is the truth. And I have never seen that as explicitly borne out as it is at the moment with the situation in Gaza. So, I obviously grew up as a very privileged person in an apartheid system, apartheid being an Afrikaans word that means separateness, as I'm sure most of you know. And everything about the situation in South Africa was determined by the color of one's skin. I had to, this morning, take my daughter, who is now 21, back to university in Cambridge for her final term. And I was telling her I was coming here after dropping her. And it made me think that the first time I started talking to her about South Africa and about the apartheid system, I said to her, yeah, so, you know, as a white person, legally, there were things I was allowed to do that your mother, because my wife is Bangladeshi, would not have been allowed to do, simply because of the color of her skin. And Maya, my daughter, sort of looked at me quizzically, and she pointed and she said, but why do you call yourself white? I said, what do you mean? And she said, you're not white, you're pink. So I said, yeah, but you can't really, you know, a pink supremacist state just doesn't have the same sort of ring about it. And it's really important to remember that in the apartheid system, which was a system of racist white supremacy, your race not only determined where you could live, in which suburb, who you could have a relationship with, let alone marry, what jobs you could and couldn't do, where you were allowed to be at what time of day, what park bench you could and couldn't sit on, what public transport you could and couldn't use. It would have even been illegal for Simone, my wife of over 30 years, and I, to be alone in a car together. Now, maybe I'm just old, but I really don't know what they thought we were going to get up to in this car. But that is the absurdity of a racist system. Now, the other important element of corruption, of apartheid, that it is worth talking about is that you've got all these people who aren't the right color, who you have to somehow deal with. And you've got to try and pretend to the world that you're being very nice to them. So our solution in South Africa, where we believe, or at least our rulers do, that we were basically the last bastion of white Christian civilization in what was an amoral world. And everybody who didn't understand that, the United Nations in particular, and all their agency, there was something wrong with them. They were agents of communism. They were agents of assimilation. They were agents of immorality. And we actually had something called the Immorality Act, in terms of which Simone and I couldn't be in that car alone together. But what we did about this is we created 13 Bantustans, little states that our government claimed were independent. Now, these were 13 little states on 6% of the land, and it was the worst of the land, that was meant to be home to 83% of the population. Not great maths. So we spoke about apartheid as separate but equal development. And the reason I raise that nonsense of the apartheid state is because it is no different to the nonsense we hear from the Israeli state. You know, look at the attacks on the UN, on the International Court of Justice, after the court made its interim ruling against Israel. It was a sense for me of déjà vu of what the apartheid rulers in South Africa had said about the rest of the world all the time. But I suppose that shouldn't have come as a surprise to me. Because Apartheid South Africa's greatest ally on the planet was the apartheid state of Israel. And this is incredibly important to what we're talking about tonight. Apartheid Israel provided military training, weapons, and the technology that enabled apartheid South Africa to become a nuclear state. And why would there be such a close relationship? Because the apartheid South African state was run by actual Nazis. People who during the Second World War in South Africa had been put in camps, detention camps, because of their Nazi sympathies. And so we had the extraordinary situation of a chap called B.J. Foster, who was our Prime Minister. He had been our most brutal Minister of Justice, who had had people who were campaigning for an end to apartheid simply thrown out of the 10th floor window of police headquarters in Johannesburg, named after him, the B.J. Foster building. This man went to Israel on an official visit, was welcomed as a hero, and the first place he visited was Yad Vashem, the memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. And after that, he went to meet Shimon Peres, the then Israeli Prime Minister, and that's where they negotiated the nuclear deal. Now, why do I know that detail? I was 11 or 12 at the time. Because I remember sitting with my mother, watching television, and seeing this happen, seeing Foster visiting Yad Vashem. And my mother was furious and outraged. And, you know, as an 11 or 12-year-old, I didn't know what the problem was. I couldn't understand. I mean, I didn't like this guy because sort of I'd realized my parents didn't like him very much. But he was visiting some country and he was visiting some museum. Well, for my mother, it was far more than that. Because my mother, who was Viennese and obviously Jewish, had survived the Holocaust in occupied Vienna. And she had survived by being hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. And whenever there was a Gestapo or SS raid in the area they lived in Vienna, she was rolled into a carpet, and that carpet was pushed up against the wall and coal was packed around it, just in case the soldiers managed to shoot off the lock of the steel door leading down to the cellar, where my mother and her mother, also Jewish, would have been found and sent to a concentration camp. In fact, she lost dozens of her extended family in Theresienstadt and primarily in Auschwitz. So to see an actual Nazi visiting Yad Vashem when he had supported the murder of 6 million Jews and 6 million other people, supposedly representing South Africa, and the fact that the state of Israel invited this man and treated him with full state honors was deeply repulsive to my mother. And I'm very fortunate because when my mother, who met my dad in London, he had been sent here by his mother from Johannesburg. She was Orthodox Jewish. And my father had committed the ultimate sin of getting involved with a non-Jewish woman. So my grandmother sent him to London. And there he did something that was almost as bad. He at least met a Jewish woman, but she was a Jewish working class woman. So my grandmother wasn't exactly thrilled when they returned to South Africa together. But when my mom arrived in South Africa and saw the reality of the apartheid system, she recalled to my sister and I that she understood the concept that she had learned in the aftermath of the Holocaust, of never again, as not just applying to Jews, but as applying to all human beings. And here she was on the southern tip of Africa, and she saw the vast majority of the population, people who were classified as non-white, as Black African, as Asian, or as colored, people of mixed race. And depending on which of those you were, you got different status. And so she got involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And I suppose that's where my politics came from. But the interesting thing, because my mom spoke about how the Nazis she encountered were not just the oppressor who saw Jews as less than human. They themselves had been totally dehumanized. She said they detested ordinary human beings because they were Jewish. But they had turned themselves into animals through their hatred. And the way they behaved was the way only the worst of the animal kingdom behaved. And we should always remember that when the oppressor dehumanizes the oppressed, they're in the process dehumanizing themselves. And how else can we understand what Yara was telling us about the opinions and the sentiments of the vast majority of all ordinary Israelis today? 43% of them don't think the IDF has been aggressive enough in its actions in Gaza. What do they want? A nuclear bomb? They probably complained then that didn't cause enough immediate pain and suffering, that death was too quick in that way. I mean, what has happened to these people? And you look at their ruler, and I know, and Yara was quite right to say, we shouldn't focus on the figure of Benjamin Netanyahu, because he is just one of the key cogs of a system and a structure that has created this machinery of oppression, of occupation, of apartheid. But this man, I must tell you, I've had the misfortune to meet him. So in the early years of our democracy, I would have to go with our political leaders for my sins, which must have been manifold, to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where we would present our country, hoping for some foreign investment. And there'd been a request for a meeting between our Premier, Tokyo Sexwale, the guy I was in Atlanta with, and the Prime Minister of Israel. I never understood why Tokyo wanted to meet Netanyahu. But I had to schlep along to the meeting because I was the economics guy. Netanyahu is, first of all, the most arrogant human being I have ever met. And I've met quite a few. But he took the biscuit. I have just never come across someone who feels such a sense of superiority to everyone around him. I mean, to the extent of sociopathy. And then the meeting, which landed up not lasting very long, because Netanyahu could not bring himself to talk to Tokyo Sexwale. Everything was addressed to me, the white Jewish dude. So the Premier would ask him a question. He wouldn't look at him while he was asking the question. He would look at me. And when he answered the question, he would answer me. And after about 10 minutes of this, I actually said to him, "My apologies, Mr. Prime Minister, perhaps you don't understand. This is the Premier. I am just his advisor. This is the person who you're having the meeting with." He walked out of the meeting. The man is an unreconstructed racist piece of shit. And I'm sorry to use the language, but that is what he is. And if anybody tells me that when you talk about a world leader, you should talk about them politely, I'll get even more impolite. Because we should only talk politely about these people if they deserve it. And the psychopath, who is ultimately responsible for the murder of over 33,000 innocent people in 6 months, deserves no respect, deserves no politeness. What he deserves is to spend the rest of his life in jail. And if there was an iota of sanity in this world, that is what would happen. Now, it's also important to note that my former boss, Nelson Mandela, who of course was described as a terrorist by the governments of Britain and the United States, amongst others, and in fact, Margaret Thatcher actually suggested privately to the South African government that they should kill Nelson Mandela because it was too dangerous to keep him alive, even in a maximum security prison on an island off the shore of Cape Town, a fact of which Mandela reminded her when they met. He was speaking in the Great Hall in Parliament, Westminster, and Mrs. Thatcher, who had obviously retired by then, this was before he was president, came hobbling in and smilingly walked up to him. And Mr. Mandela, being the person he is, walked up to her and greeted her and said, "You must be surprised that I'm here." And she sort of looked a bit confused. And he said, "Am I right? Or was it you who wanted me killed?" So Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I regarded as a friend and a political mentor in many ways, who knew far more about apartheid than I did as some little privileged white boy, both described Israel as an apartheid state and actually said that the apartheid in Israel is far worse than the apartheid in South Africa. Why? Because in South Africa, our economy was entirely dependent on an incredibly cheap labor force to work in the mines, to do all of the work that the privileged whites didn't want to do, and for what were quite literally slave wages. So we couldn't go massacring tens of thousands of them the way Israel is doing to the Palestinians. We needed them. And as a consequence, our horrific, tragic massacres at places like Sharpeville in 1960, or Soweto in 1976, or Boipatong in 1990, they involved a few hundred people who were shot dead in cold blood for protesting against their oppression. But then the world was outraged. Even the governments of countries like the United Kingdom and the United States of America, who were clandestinely supporting the apartheid state in South Africa. Today, those countries and the entire so-called Western world, virtually entire, defend whatever Israel does, refuse to criticize Israel. There is no clandestine support. There is explicit support. And those of us who dare to criticize Israel, regardless of our backgrounds, if we've been lifelong anti-racists, if you mention Mandela or Tutu's criticism of Israel, oh, those anti-Semites. Or if it's a Jewish person who happens to be the child of Holocaust survivors, or is themselves a Holocaust survivor. Oh, you self-hating racist Jew. This is the madness we confront today, where the racists describe the anti-racists as racist to defend the indefensible slaughter of tens of thousands of people. So how on earth have we got here? Well, I have to take a slight diversion at this point to tell you that from this total failure of our politics, because that's what it is. You know, the United States of America, we have an election that some of you might have seen before between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. You might not know that Joe Biden forged his political career as the senator for Delaware. Because I've investigated corruption, etc., for the last 23 years, I happen to know that Delaware is an onshore, offshore jurisdiction. In other words, a bit like the Channel Islands, a bit like places like the Bahamas or the British Virgin Islands. In other words, it's a laundromat for illicit money. So you won't be shocked to hear that the senator from that state, for goodness knows how many decades, is himself deeply corrupt. Deeply corrupt. His family has been making fortunes in Ukraine long before the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then next to him is a guy who never seems to spend more than a few minutes at a time outside of a courthouse. Be it for being declared bankrupt, which has happened 7 times, but he presents himself as a business person of genius. The guy had a billionaire father. If he'd taken the money his father left him, stuck it under his bed, he'd be a hell of a lot wealthier than he is today. So I don't know where the genius comes into. Certainly not in his knowledge of international affairs or political issues. And this is the best they have to offer us for the second election in a row. And in this country, and I say this as a short person, which is why I started where I did, we have little Rishi Sunak, who will be contesting the election against little Keir Starmer. Now, I don't know if you know, but Keir Starmer, who happens to be my constituency MP, is no taller than me. I didn't know this. I managed to catch a glimpse of him at a football match recently because I was on the stairs, so I could see through his phalanx of about 16 security guards, which he needs to go and be, you know, the ordinary man in the street to watch football. I don't know what had happened to my 16 security guards. I must have walked too fast and left them somewhere or something. But I was quite shocked at how small he is. And I'm beginning to think that short people just shouldn't go into politics. Because I'm afraid to say, neither of them are very good at it. Sunak, who married into a multi-billionaire family, interestingly, a family whose main business make a lot of money in Russia, and who somehow evaded the sanctions that were applied on Russians and people working with Russian companies in the wake of the illegal invasion of Ukraine, which I'm sure had nothing to do with the fact that son-in-law Rishi is the prime minister, because I'm sure that's not how government and politics work. And Keir Starmer, who claims at some point in his life to have been a human rights lawyer. Now, I want to know what appalling tragic event occurred that resulted in his amnesia. Because this is a human rights lawyer who has yet to comment on the fact that the highest court on the planet, a court that adjudicates only on what is described legally as the crime of crimes, genocide, has found a plausible risk, in other words, prima facie evidence, that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. But this man, the leader of a democratic socialist party that he ensures is by no means democratic and by no means socialist, hasn't even managed to pass one comment on probably the most important legal decision in human rights history since the end of the Second World War. And this is the choice that we deserve? So, why are our politics like this? Well, the global trade in weapons is a business that counts its profits in the billions and should, but doesn't, count its losses in human lives. It is a business that is responsible for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. Why is that? Well, everything that happens in the arms trade happens behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. So when I wrote that book there, and by the way, this is wonderful. I've never seen it that big. It is 555 pages with 3,000 footnotes. But it's normally smaller than that. When I wrote that book, the first edition came out at the end of 2011. It's now in its 10th or 11th edition. It was the first book written on the global arms trade since 1979. Why? Because no one can access this information. I just happened to, because when I was an MP, I ran the main financial oversight committee. And I had a look into an arms deal in which our new government, when Mandela had resigned and Mbeki took over, my own party, the ANC, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that we had absolutely no need of. This is at a time when 6 million South Africans were living with HIV or AIDS. And our President Thabo Mbeki said we couldn't afford to provide them with antiretroviral medication to keep them alive. But we had 10 billion spare to spend on weapons we didn't need and haven't used. Why? Because $350 million at least of bribes were paid to the politicians who made the decisions about what to buy and who to buy it from. The senior officials in the department, and of course the head of the South African National Defence Force. So when we contested our second democratic election in 1999, I didn't realize we had so much money for that campaign. That money came from the bribes that were paid on the arms deal. And I thought at the time when I wrote my first book called After the Party, that we were just particularly naive and stupid in South Africa. None of us expected to be politicians or in government. We were activists fighting a liberation struggle. And then I discovered that at the same time that Tony Blair and BAE Systems were paying £115 million of bribes on one contract that BAE Systems won, big British arms company, despite not even making the shortlist because it didn't meet the technical specifications the Air Force required, And it was 2.5 times the cost of the jet that the Air Force actually wanted. It's just that BAE paid the biggest bribes, so they won it. At that same time, Tony Blair and BAE Systems were paying bribes in at least 7 other countries on similar arms deals, paying a total of over £1 billion in illegal bribes. And the vast majority of those bribes go to the political parties and to the politicians. And that is the reality of the global trade in arms. That corruption provides the money that funds our political parties and our politicians. So Tony Blair, since he's left office, has made at least £110 million personally from his decision to invade Iraq and from his association with British and American arms companies like BAE Systems. So that Keir Starmer knows that only if he lasts as long as Liz Truss in 10 Downing Street. Do you remember her? She was the one who was in office for 40-something days that cost us £74 billion. And who now thinks she has the right to comment on British and global politics. She shouldn't have the right to leave her own toilet. She should be stuck in there listening to herself, basically. If Keir Starmer only serves as long as her, but makes the right decisions that those who put him in power want him to make, he knows that he'll be a multimillionaire for the rest of his life. And that is why today, Britain, the United States of America, and Western Europe have the best democracy money can buy. That is the reality of why our politics are so shocking. And what do we need to enable this corruption to oil the wheels of our political systems? We need conflict. So, whenever there is a disagreement, whenever there is a dispute, do we choose the diplomatic route to try and ensure peace? Of course not. We crank up the arms machine and off we go. The United States of American government employs more people to manage one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire globe. The United States of America has 12 aircraft carriers today. And it is only if we have the conflict that we can continue to justify our ever-increasing defense budget, which are already at absurd record levels, because our politicians can constantly tell us about the myriad threats that face us. But the problem is that in creating those threats, one of the great tools in our arsenal is racism. The same sort of racism that I saw enacted in South Africa. The same racism that informs the apartheid state of Israel. And how does it manifest today? Well, try being a Muslim in today's Britain. Try being a progressive Jew in Keir Starmer's Labour Party, where he's managed to expel more Jews since he's been leader than in the entire history of the party before he became leader, supposedly to combat anti-Semitism. Now look, I'm not particularly smart, but that sounds to me a little bit like the ANC back in the day deciding to expel Nelson Mandela in order to combat racism. It doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. It really doesn't. But that is what is happening. But the terrifying thing is, while we live in a country that exhibits a hierarchy of racism, where we talk constantly about how in the last 6 months, anti-Semitism has increased, and it has. And it's a horrible thing that shouldn't exist. And by anti-Semitism, I mean hatred of Jews as Jews. I don't mean criticism of Israel. While that has risen, we are silent about the fact that Islamophobia in this country in the same period of time has risen almost 30% more than anti-Semitism, because we don't care. Why? Because an enormous amount of the Islamophobia in this and other Western countries come from the state themselves. And if you look at that speech of Rishi Sunak outside 10 Downing Street, the fact that he is a so-called brown person is irrelevant. It was one of the most Islamophobic political rants I've ever heard in my life. And I've had to sit through George W. Bush ranted in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11. We are seeing before our eyes a genocide happening in real time. And I wish I could say just that our governments are doing nothing about it. But that's not the case. They're enabling it. They're facilitating it. They're arming it. And therefore, because of the nature of the trade in weapons, they are profiting from it. That is the most terrifying thing of all. And it is our responsibility as taxpayers, whose money is being used for this, because defense companies are the most subsidized companies on the planet. Most of them wouldn't be in business if it wasn't for government subsidies. It is being done in our names, with our money. And it is now up to us to do something about it, because our politicians and our government have failed us. So what can we do? And this is where I'm going to conclude. First of all, the fact that the PSC exists in this area is incredibly important. The fact that you're having meetings like this is incredibly important. The fact that you're having local protests is incredibly important. And that I hope a lot of you get up to London for the national protests when they happen as well, and bring family and friends and people you don't know with you. Because it's not only important to people on the ground in Gaza. And my organization, Shadow World Investigations, is tracking the weapons that are being used, together with an organization in Gaza called Workers in Palestine. So we speak to them every few days. And they keep on telling us, please tell people that we thank them for their support. That as we hear the drones and the planes that bring more death and destruction, we know there are millions of people all over the world who are supporting us. And because it puts pressure on our government, we have to keep on demanding a ceasefire, even though it's 6 months past deadline. We have to demand a halt to all arms sales to Israel. Our government is breaking British law every day. When flights leave from the RAF base in Cyprus to take bombs and missiles and spare parts for the planes that drop them to Israel. Because it is those bombs and missiles that killed 250 people today, most of them women and children. And it is the new replenishment of bombs and missiles that are going to kill another 250 innocent people tomorrow. So we have to demand an end to arms sales to Israel. But then we also have to demand an end to occupation. And I can't believe I'm saying this in 2024, an end to apartheid. How can there still be a legally entrenched system of racist apartheid in the year 2024? And that to criticize it is to be racist. We have to call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel. It was BDS, together with the extraordinary courage of millions of South Africans who made their country ungovernable by its own government, together with tens of millions of you around the world who refused to buy South African goods, who refused to bank with Barclays because they financed apartheid, who refused to buy petrol from Shell because they provided oil to the apartheid military. And you know how that brought about an end to apartheid? It eroded our economy to the extent that the quality of life of privileged white South Africans like me started to decline. And that's when the apartheid rulers knew the game was up. And that's what we have to do to Israel. It is the only way that somebody as arrogant, as racist, and frankly, and I say this as someone who has 3 degrees in clinical psychology, as frankly mad as Benjamin Netanyahu is going to see sense. We have to take action against our own arms companies who are providing the weapons for this conflict. So around here, L3 Harris, there is a big campaign against them that you must all get involved in. BAE Systems, that has factories all over the country. Elbit Systems, which is Israel's biggest arms company and used to have 10 factories in the United Kingdom. Why? It now only has 7, because 3 of them have been permanently closed down by a direct action group called Palestine Action. So get involved in those sorts of activities, because that is going to do more to save lives in Gaza than the pontificating and justifications for defending genocide of our government and politicians. And then crucially, politicians, and I know this from experience, only understand 2 languages. The languages of votes and the languages of money. Deprive them of both. If you're a member of one of the 2 major parties in this country, don't give them 1 penny of your money until they stop supporting genocide, until they're prepared to stop all arms sales to Israel and other regimes involved in conflicts like that. And most importantly, and this is something again, it's not just about you doing this or you talking to family about this and friends about this. It's about talking to people you don't even know yet. Do not vote at a local level, at a regional level, at a national level for any politician who refused to support a ceasefire at the very earliest opportunity. Because how on earth can you entrust a human being with representing you if they're prepared to watch what we have watched every day on our screens, of those children having to endure operations to try and stay alive without anesthetic, of the little girl who was too terrified to cross the street because she'd seen both her brothers killed when they crossed the street. Anybody who sees that and still will not support a ceasefire because their political career is more important does not deserve your vote. Please. And let us do that to honor all of those who have been murdered with our weapons in our names in Yemen and in Gaza and in who knows what conflicts in the future. And let us also do it to support those who are still trying every single day to stay alive. And finally, let's do it to honor what Nelson Mandela said when he emerged after 27 years, just like Marwan Barghouti, in an apartheid prison. He didn't say, yay, let's party. He said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people.
We have one written question, which I'll give you now. And is there anybody in the audience who wants to ask? Lucette, could you take that? I could just give you this question.
Just one quick question and another question. So, can you please say, in the middle of that speech, which was amazing, really good speech, you described Netanyahu, you gave him about four adjectives before you said his name. Can you say that again so I can write it down? Secondly, more importantly actually, when I discuss Palestine and Israel with people, they go, well, Israel is not an apartheid state because look at all the Arabs doing really well in Israel and stuff. And they always throw that at me. So how, as activists, would you counter that argument with your experience of apartheid South Africa? Thank you.
I've got a question, but I've got a couple of statements as well. I'm underneath the speaker over there, so I'll come over here. Just to let people know that the L3 Harris installation in Brighton is on Home Farm Road, BN19HU. I went there today. They protest outside the gates at L3 Harris, and there is also Brighton Peace Camp, which has set up on Home Farm Road, and people can go along and support them, take them down food and anything that you can to. They're camped out in tents on Home Farm Road, and they go along and they protest every day. Do join them. The other thing is that I am one of those politicians who called for a ceasefire at the very beginning. I spoke at a PSC rally in October last year. I'm Mike Munson and I am standing as the parliamentary candidate for the Green Party. The Green Party called for a ceasefire within 7 days of October the 7th, and it condemned Hamas and it condemned the genocide that was already happening in Gaza. My question is, you mentioned Rishi Sunak, who's sixth in the line of 6 shades of shit in the Tory party. You mentioned that Keir Starmer, and you mentioned Netanyahu, and they are all just figureheads of the parties that they represent. Do you think it would be any different if the Labour Party was not run by Keir Starmer, or would he be just replaced by another establishment Zionist supporting figure?
And one more?
I was always led to believe that the Church, Church of England particularly, had a role to play in bringing down apartheid in terms of their divestment. I don't know if that's true, to the extent that I understood, but the question is really, is there any, I suppose, is there something more that the Church has done, the Church of England has done, almost nothing, other than support, put out statements supporting Israel. They've done slightly more since Munter Isaac has been very vocal, a Palestinian Christian pastor in Bethlehem. Do you think that there is any role for the church, and if so, in terms of sort of counteracting some of the political, negligence, or not, or is that a kind of a just hopeful thinking?
Thank you very much for those. And I've got one written one that I'm going to incorporate into my response to Mike's comments and questions. I can't even remember the adjectives I used to describe Benjamin Netanyahu, but I assume they included arrogant, racist, I might have forgotten mendacious, corrupt, mediocre, and I could carry on for days. So the Arabs doing well in Israel line. As a Jewish person my mom had a cousin who was 2 years older than her, who today lives in Silver Springs, just outside Washington, D.C. She's 93 years old. She still has in her cupboard the striped pajamas she was liberated in. She was 15 when she was liberated. She had seen her brother and her mother murdered in front of her eye, and she assumed her father had been murdered too. She was from Czechoslovakia, as it then was, and she was given the option to travel to Palestine, and she took it. And she discovered in Palestine that her father had survived, and that he too was in Palestine. You can understand the desire for some sort of safe haven, for some sort of safety of the Jewish people in the wake of the Holocaust. You'd have to be inhuman not to. But you can't get away from the fact that this Jewish state, so an ethno-nationalist state, was created on the land and literally on the body of another people. Zionists talk of a land with no people, for a people with no land. That is a lie. And it's exactly what white settlers said when they arrived on the southern tip of Africa in 1652. There's no one here, it is our land, and they claimed it. What I asked in my history classes at school in South Africa was, if there was no one here and it was our land, why were we fighting all these wars? For decades, in fact, for hundreds of years after we turned up here, who were we fighting these wars against? Shadows? Trees? Animals? Because there were people there, and we stole their land. It's something called settler colonialism. And one genocide doesn't make right a Nakba or another genocide of the people of Gaza today. And I cannot tell you how difficult it is to hear over and over again, just like you did during the apartheid South African days, this sort of nonsense. Apartheid apologists, the vast, vast majority of whom tended to be white, would always say, but the blacks are so happy in South Africa. Boris Johnson, crook in chief, spoke about Africans as black people with watermelon smiles. And the media here, you would have believed that the whole world rejoiced when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. Across Africa, this country was ridiculed that you had this moronic racist as prime minister who couldn't even brush his bloody hair. So, you know, this sort of stuff. Oh, Arabs have done well in Israel. Ask the majority of Arabs in Israel who are Israeli citizens and who have inferior rights in every respect to Jewish Israeli citizens, because that's what apartheid is, as defined by the Rome Statute. And yes, if they can find half a dozen Arabs or a family who maybe are making money out of the Israeli military-industrial complex who are doing well, hallelujah. You know, there were sellouts in apartheid South Africa too. The reality is, if you are classified as legally inferior, you're not doing well. And I think that's the way to deal with that nonsense. And, you know, I would put a bit of money on it, that a lot of the people who are suggesting that are themselves people of privilege. And, you know, I am still a person of privilege. I'm a middle-class person. I write books. I make royalties. I get paid a good salary to run this little investigative organization. And it's easy for me to say so-and-so is doing well or not doing well. We have to give voice to the oppressed. And that's something in Jewish history that I'm incredibly proud of, is that we have always done that. And that's why, as long as there has been Zionism, which is an ideology, a political ideology, there has been anti-Zionism. And now our remarkably intelligent governments have decided that anti-Zionism is equivalent to anti-Semitism. So half of historical Jewish thinkers who were the purveyors of anti-Zionism from the time there was Zionism are now suddenly anti-Semites. Or we describe them as self-hating or non-Jews. You know, this sort of revisionist nonsense. All it shows is how we have atrophied our brains to justify the madness that we are allowing to take place in our world. So I think we have to put those sort of statements in their right contexts. And we have to make those comparisons between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. Because it astonishes me how most Western countries could get behind the boycott of apartheid Israel, but even the mention of South Africa, but even the mention of a boycott of Israel is seen as some crime against humanity. Please, what Mike has said, L3 Harris, on your doorstep. This is a company that is providing components to the Israeli military-industrial complex. We can't say we don't know what to do, there's nothing we can do. There's a hell of a lot we can do. You can go down, you can support the protesters, you can become a protester. There will be some who will commit direct action at some point. You don't have to do that. Not everyone is in a position to scale up a building. I mean, it would probably take me half a day. Not everyone is in a position where they can afford to get arrested and they have someone who's going to bail them out, look after their kids, put food on the table at home if they're in jail. Do what you can. You can also, when you go into the supermarket and you buy hummus, have a look where it's made. Have a look, there's a very clear, have a look at the BDS National Committee's list of companies to boycott. It's really not difficult. So you've got to swap where you get your coffee to try and help save tens of thousands of lives. That's not a huge sacrifice. We did it for South Africa. We can do it for Palestine. In every constituency in this country, and this should apply at a local level and when we have a general election at some point during this year, have a look at the candidates who are standing. If you're lucky enough, you know, there are some people in the Labour Party who are really good people and have been very good on Palestine. Not many, but there are some left who haven't yet been expelled. And if you're lucky enough to live in an area that has one of them, support them, vote for them. If you're lucky enough to live in an area where you have someone like Mike or you have another Green candidate who is unequivocal in their support of Palestine, who is unequivocal in their support of people struggling in this country with a cost of living crisis, who is sick of the political corruption of our ruling class, support them, vote for them, get others to vote for them. And if there's no one, and that's going to be the case in wards and constituencies, get together as a community and identify someone from your community. We are supposed to live in a liberal representative democracy. What that should mean is not that we have a group of remarkably arrogant and surprisingly, almost to a person, remarkably wealthy people who sit in a very nice building that's falling down in the center of London and supposedly represent us. I mean, Keir Starmer has never represented me for 1 second of his life in the House of Commons. And I think probably many of you can say that about your so-called representatives. Representatives should be people from the community, ordinary people, who are prepared to sacrifice 5 years of their lives, who should be guaranteed their job on their return from Parliament where they've represented us all. And they do just that. They represent us. They're accountable to us. They come back and tell us at least once a month what they've done the past month, what's coming up the next month, and hear from us what we want them to do about that. They're not supposed to be sitting there representing their own interests to ensure that they're going to be bloody wealthy for the rest of their lives. So please, this is the idea of active citizenship. Let's save the little bits of democracy we have left. And let's shock the political class in these local elections and in a national election in the future. In terms, relating to our political class, Peter Rolfe has asked, is it likely that Sunak is making money from arms sales? Now, indirectly, because his wife's family business is a technology business called Infosys, one of the biggest technology companies on the planet.
It's Sunak, right?
Sorry?
It's Sunak.
Yeah, Sunak's wife's family company. She's much wealthier than him. I'm sure somewhere in the technology business, they're involved in the arms trade. But that's almost not the point. The point is that he is making money from the arms trade, just as Keir Starmer is, because those defense companies, in return for Starmer and Sunak's uncritical support of anything that those arms companies do, including sending the bombs and missiles and spare parts for the planes that drop them to Israel every single day from Cyprus. In return for that, who do you think are the biggest donors to the two major political parties in this country? The defense company. So of course they're making money from the arms trade. And finally, the Church of England. The church played such a crucial role in bringing about an end to apartheid in South Africa. Such a crucial role. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, which meant he was head of the Anglican Church for the whole of Southern Africa. He was crucial to the defeat of apartheid with the support of the church. The church can't make up its mind on Israel. You know, just like Germany can't make up its mind on Israel and is making a fool of themselves as a consequence. The church has to do what its conscience guides it to do. That's my understanding of spirituality. I know it's very simplistic, but what does the conscience of any human being, of any institution that has its roots in spirituality tell us to do at the moment? So I think we need to put pressure on the Church of England to do far, far more than just defend Israel. Of course, we all have to be outraged by the human suffering on October the 7th. We have to understand it in the context of 75 years of occupation, 30 years of blockade. But we have to feel humanity for those human beings. Otherwise, we're not human. But over 33,000 people have now been slaughtered. And the Archbishop of Canterbury can't bring himself to say, stop, don't give them any more weapons. That's outrageous. So those of you who are in the church must use that position to exert pressure on the church. I don't think we have time for any more, is my guess.
No.
So I want to just end by saying, if people do have other questions, I'm happy to be outside so they can close up the building and you can come and ask me those questions. But, you know, we've spoken about some very bleak things tonight. We've heard from Palestine itself, and thank you so much for organizing that. Because I think, you know, to listen to some schmuck from the southern tip of Africa talking about this stuff is one thing. But to hear it from a Palestinian who is sitting on the West Bank, where, as Yara said, hundreds of people have also been murdered since the 7th of October, is just so important. Because these people have agency and have their own voices, and we must do whatever we can to amplify them. But it has been bleak, and I apologize for that. And I ran out of short person jokes very quickly to try and give a bit of levity. But I just want to end by telling you one thing. In 1986, I had to leave South Africa at 48 hours notice, because I'd almost without realizing been recruited into the ANC underground structures. And I had compulsory military service in the apartheid military that I was supposed to start. So my organization got me out of the country. And the night before I left, I couldn't even tell my family what was happening. The night before I left, I was sitting on a hill overlooking Cape Town, which in my completely unbiased opinion is the most beautiful city on the planet. And I thought, I will never again in my life set foot in the city or country of my birth. Because in 1986, if someone had told me that apartheid was on its last legs, I would have used my training as a clinical psychologist and offered them a straitjacket, because there was absolutely zero prospect of that. And nobody thought that was going to be the case. 4 years later, the ANC was unbanned, so I could return home. All our political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, were free. And a further 4 years after that, we became a democracy for the first time since 1652. And Nelson Mandela was elected our first president. So even at the bleakest times, things can change very quickly through human agency, through South Africans making the country ungovernable and tens of millions of you supporting the struggle against apartheid. Please don't lose hope. And if you want to know what to do, don't look to anyone else. Look in the mirror, because each one of us has to do our part. Thank you so much for the invitation.